We we are in Isaiah chapter 19. That verse 1 begins the burden of Egypt. We covered one verse last week, and then y'all chased rabbits the entire time. But verses 1 through 4 deals with civil war and anarchy in Egypt. And the fact that God is coming in a swift cloud in judgment against Egypt. There would be civil war where they were fighting against themselves. And then the nation turns to witchcraft, sorcery, and that type of spiritualism and mysticism. And that brings us to verse 4, where we're going to begin this evening. And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. If y'all notice that, saith the Lord of hosts, notice the difference in the way that the word Lord is and Lord. The first one, saith the Lord, capital L with lowercase O-R-D. And then the Lord of hosts, the second one, capital L, and then even though it doesn't show on the screen, it's small caps actually, O-R-D. Now what's the difference? You have American Standard. Yeah. The word Lord, when it says saith the Lord, it's Hebrew word Adonai, which means master or Lord. Then the Lord of hosts, second one, is, as the King James or the American Standard has, Jehovah or Yahweh. The basis of that word is the idea of existing one. It is much like what we would use as God, in that it can refer to the Father, the Son, or the Spirit. It is the name by which God was known during the Old Testament. But the reason that they use Lord in this way is because it was a name that the Hebrews or the Jews would not pronounce. And since Hebrew was a spoken language, what they did is they substituted Adonai for Yahweh or Jehovah. So now then, when we come to, and Hebrew was written without vowels initially, and then they go back in after the fact and they insert little markings that would indicate the vowels. So when they come to Yahweh, really you have 4 letters with no vowels initially, because it was not a spoken word. Now, why would they not speak it? Because It was a holy name, and they were afraid that if they should even use it in an improper way, they would be struck dead by God.
Big difference now. They don't mind using that name.
Well, that's the point that I was getting to. There's a lot of disrespect today in God's name, using God's name. They had the utmost respect for the name of God. They so much so that they would not even pronounce, and you could, to a great extent, you could say Yahweh or Jehovah was the name of God.
Is that where they would even stop and take a shower, bathe, change their clothes before they're writing?
I believe so, yes. They would, but I don't know that for certain. I've heard that story. Dale?
Is the New Testament parallel John 8:58 is where Abraham was, I am in Exodus 3, or is that incorrect?
Okay, John 8:58 with Jesus saying, before Abraham was, I am. Yes, it would tie into this name. It goes directly back to Exodus 3 and verse 14, where Moses asked, who shall I say sent me? And God says to tell them, I am sent you. I am that I am. And since you mentioned that, John 8 and verse 24 also is, unless you believe that King James says, I am he, ye shall die in your sins. Literally, it is, unless you believe that I am, ye shall die in your sins. There is no he. And it was a mistake to translate it that way. Unless you believe that I am. Well, he's calling himself Yahweh by that. And so, yes, those terms do apply in that way. Just as an additional thought now, to bring this more full circle as far as the New Testament is concerned, guess what word that the translators of the Septuagint translation used for Yahweh? Nobody has a guess? Lord. That is the word that they used. They use the Greek word kurios, which is translated Lord in the New Testament. So many times, depends on context, of course, when you see Lord in reference to a New Testament term, whether it's generally it's talking about Christ, sometimes it's talking about the Father or the Spirit, but it goes back to that basic idea of the Old Testament Yahweh, that Lord was the translation of that word. Now then, how many times does that word apply specifically to Christ? And then does that, you think back under the Old Testament and all the references to Yahweh, by far the majority of times you see the word Lord, it's Jehovah or Yahweh. And yes, that's to distinguish Adonai from Yahweh. Adonai, master, ruler, and that's the lowercase. The small caps, or as this one has all caps, Yahweh, and that way you can tell the difference. But that's kind of as an aside, chasing another rabbit. Okay, Dale.
When it uses small Lord and then follows way to cause respect in the mind of the reader in a formal sense, so that they'll know after they've read it that that's what they're showing respect to God? Is that the reason they put it in that grammatical form? Is that the reason for it?
No, because it uses, the Hebrew has Adonai and then Yahweh.
What's the point, though, of putting all those words in that small area? What's that supposed to create in the mind?
Well, ask God.
Oh, okay.
God's the one who inspired it to be written that way.
I might not want to care about it, I don't do it anyway, but I gotta make sure
I
I'm
mean,
saved.
God's the one who wrote it that way. You have to ask Him.
I gotta make sure I'm saved.
So,
Of course.
sometimes instead of using Lord, though, in all caps, it will use God. You have to. There's a few occurrences of that as well. But in this verse, God is going to give the Egyptians over to a cruel, a fierce king, Lord in this case, master or ruler, to rule over them. Now then, you get into another big discussion, though, as to who is this cruel Lord. And I'm going to read a few quotes just to give you to kind of show you the extent of this discussion. First one is by Lyndall Mitchell. Some of you may remember him. He spoke on the lectureship here one year. He wrote, "The identity of the cruel master of Isaiah 19 is much debated. With Watts, I believe it to be Shabaka, who first established the Ethiopian dynasty's authority over the Delta cities in 716 to 712 BC. This fits the Ethiopia-Egypt polarity described by Isaiah in chapters 18 and 19. It also fits the time frame of Isaiah's ministry. There is no shortage of suggestions among commentators concerning the identity of this particular tyrant. Some favor Sargon. They contend that the text necessitates a foreign tyrant, and Ethiopia is not foreign enough to suit them." And he adds, really? He goes on, "If you break away from the contextual setting, almost anyone who ever conquered Egypt will do. However, if you remain within the contextual settings, 18 and 19, Shabaka fits best." Then Wayne Jackson. He writes, "Most probably this prophecy was fulfilled when Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians in 671 BC and came under the cruel reign of Esarhaddon, who ruled from 681 to 669 BC. He says, "Archaeologists have discovered a stone monument which represents Esarhaddon holding Taharku, king of Egypt and Ethiopia, on a leash." Pulpit Commentary agrees that it refers to Esarhaddon. Jameson Fawcett Brown Commentary, on the other hand, says Newton, that's another author, makes a general reference to be Nebuchadnezzar and a particular reference to Cambyses, son of Cyrus, and Cyrus is who killed the Egyptian god Apis. So son of Cyrus and Ochus, Persian conquerors of Egypt, noted for their fierce cruelty. And then they write, Gesenius, who is a Hebrew scholar, and his work he has a lexicon on the Old Testament words, is one of the standard works on Hebrew English definitions. But they add Gesenius refers it to, and I'll mispronounce this one, Sumaticus, who had brought into Egypt Greek and other foreign mercenaries to subdue the other 11 princes of the Dodecary. Semiticus. Semiticus.
He was the father of Pharaoh Necho, who slew Josiah.
So as you see, there's all sorts of ideas as to who this cruel Lord is. Bill?
Over in Ezekiel 29 and verse 19, it says, therefore, thus saith the Lord God, surely I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He shall take away her wealth, carry off her spoils, and move her pillage, and that will be wages for his army.
And that would no doubt be one of the reasons that Jameson, Fawcett, Brown in their commentary leaned toward Nebuchadnezzar. A lot of it deals with, okay, when did Isaiah write this prophecy or make this prophecy? As well as historical references. So, whoever it refers to, though, you see that he is going to be very fierce, cruel in his rule over the Egyptians.
Warner's indication may be more than one. Lord,
Okay. And not just one. There's another one you'd throw into the ring, that it has reference to different ones, basically. So now then, whoever wants to do a study of all the archaeological references and all of the, I don't. But I'm just trying to basically emphasize nobody really knows for certain.
just take God's word for it.
He was a bad dude. That says it all. Whoever it was, and it could be several different ones. He was a bad dude, as far as the Egyptians are concerned and his dealings with them. Now then, in verses 5 through verse 10, we have material depression upon Egypt. In verse 5, he says that the waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be waste and dried up. This is going to be physical calamities and a punishment from God dealing with the commercial industry. The Nile River was basically the lifeblood of Egypt. I mean, everything centered upon the Nile River. That's why when Moses turned the Nile River into blood, it was such a devastating effect upon Egypt. Because, yes, it was one of their gods. They worship the Nile. But everything's centered upon it. Now then, when he talks about the waters and the river, he's dealing with the Nile itself, but it might also include the tributaries going into the Nile. And basically, he's saying that it's going to fail in the sense that it's not going to rise to the desired height. Well, what happens then is drought. And what happens when you have drought? No crops or famine. They're not going to be able to eat.
That's when the reeds and the stuff that grew out of the moisture, and then the moisture when it died, start withering and dying.
All of the entire land, all of their crops are going to die. Everything's going to die because the river's not up to the level that it needs to be. And thus, the waters fail from the sea.
Did it overflow once it used?
It would overflow at times.
Irrigate all of the crops.
It would irrigate the crops, but it would overflow at times. And by the way, when it says fell from the sea, the Nile, when it overflowed like that, was referred to as the sea. So there's a lot of historical accuracies in what Isaiah is stating here. But here's the very lifeblood of Egypt itself just failing because it just doesn't have the water that it needs. And so in verse 6, and they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and the flags shall wither. So turning the rivers far away is probably the rivers stagnate and they turn putrid. Just a minute, Dale, I'll get to you. And thus the New King James mentions that they turn foul because the rivers have stagnated. It probably has reference here to the canals. Okay, Dale.
It says here, though the root thereof wax old in the earth, and the stalk thereof in the ground, yet through the scent of water it shall bud and bring forth boughs like a plant. And then later it illustrates the final resurrection by the rising up later in the text in 12 through 15 and Job 14, 7 through 15. And it talks about the water falling from the sea, and it talks about it drying up here. It uses the same phraseology as in that 5 through 10 that you're reading there. Job 14, 7 through 15.
Okay.
Sin of water, and it relates to kind of intermingles famine, and then the sin of water occurring and it propelling again both lives.
Okay, but you're talking about two different time frames and two different places.
Yeah.
Just because similarity of language is all you're dealing with there. And what Job writes of that day and that location really doesn't have a lot to do with what Isaiah is writing dealing with Egypt, other than similarity of language, and similarity of language is used in relationship to what's taking place. It says that the brooks of defense are possibly rivers that formed moats around walled cities. I'm sure none of you have ever seen these castles that have a moat around them. Probably never seen any pictures of those. And I'm being a little facetious there. Probably everyone has seen those. That's basically what he is talking about here, except now then they've dried up.
Does that have something to do with the shipping, their defense with their navy? Could he put them in the water?
Well, that would be the case. They wouldn't be able to. But in those castles that we see has a moat around them, what's the moat used for? For water? It's for defense, for protection. An advancing army couldn't have to go through the water in order to try and get to the walls of the castle. And thus the drawbridge they could just raise up, and they're surrounded by water. So it was used for defense, and thus the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. So these moats are gone. They offer no defense now. And those would be coming from the Nile River, basically. This would also affect the plants that would depend upon the water for vegetation. The reeds and flags shall wither. So the vegetation of the area is going to wither away because, again, no water. Verse 7 then. The paper reads, by the brooks, by the mouth of the brook, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. So those things by the Nile River would be dried up and wither away. The banks along the rivers were partly grassland and partly vegetation. And thus, the most luxurious crops would be destroyed. I think Isaiah is dealing with a pretty great devastation during this period of time. Verse 8, he adds that the fishers also shall mourn, and all they that cast angle into the brook shall lament, and they that spread nets upon the waters shall languish. So now then you're dealing with the fishing industry. If the water has receded to such an extent that it's causing all of this devastation, what's going to happen to the fishing industry? It's going to be going bye-bye. Well, that would be the case. They wouldn't have any way in which to thus fish, and thus it would be basically destroyed. Someone turn over to Numbers 11 and verse 5. Numbers 11 and verse 5. Now this is the children of Israel speaking now, and they're talking to Moses. What do they say?
Remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic.
Okay. here's the fish which we did freely eat in Egypt. Well, that's gone now. Now again, that was the children of Israel complaining that they didn't have those luxuries that they had back in Egypt. But now then, Egypt is without them also, at least from what we see here.
Is that angle they cast in, is that a hook? Where'd you go get that?
Well, that's about my next point. I was going to add that the fishermen thus would be out of employment. They wouldn't have a job because there are no fish anymore. The angle, yes, would be the hook that they would use in the canals, and the net was in the waters of the Nile that would be used. So they spread the nets upon the waters, being nets that would be used in the Nile River itself, where the angle and the hooks and the brooks, that is, these tributaries that feed the Nile. So basically, in the tributaries, you're fishing more from the standpoint of individual fish. In the Nile itself, because of the size of it and all of the aspects, you use net fishing, which you hope to catch a whole bunch at one time. Their nets would not necessarily be casting nets. They would have a net that they would spread out and then bring it around, and I guess I can use the word tie it together. That would be this type of situation where they had spread out the net. It's not cast, it just spread out, and then you bring it together and you haul in all the fish. And in that case, it was so many he couldn't haul it in. And thus called for help.
They'll have a big impact on people that bait the net, but I gotta buy it. Because that spreads way out whenever you start supplying stuff for the fishermen.
Okay,
Him himself.
that would be the case. Once the fishing industry is gone, which again is a pretty big industry at that time, it's going to affect all of the other industries that feed, is that the right word? Feed the fishermen. That they, here's an individual who, for example, makes nets, who sells it to the fishing industry, who uses them. Well, if the fishing industry is destroyed and they don't have needs of the nets, and it affects the net maker. That's okay, they don't have a paycheck anymore. Again, it's showing that just shows the wide dispersion of the destruction that's coming. Verse 9 then, moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave networks shall be confounded. So now then you have the clothing and textile industry is going to suffer. Egypt, again, not only was famed for its fishing industry, but also its fine linen. Few passages. 1 Kings 10 and verse 28.
Solomon had horses brought out of Egypt and linen yard. The king's merchants received the linen yard at a price.
Okay, here's not only the horses, but the linen and yarn. So here's that being brought out of Egypt. Proverbs 7 and verse 16. So there Solomon mentions again the fine linen of Egypt. And Ezekiel 27 and verse 7. Ezekiel 27:7. Fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail, blue and purple from the isles of Elish was that which covered thee. So here's the broidered work from Egypt. So here's all of these references to that clothing and textile industry that originates in Egypt. One other reference, and would be in Luke 16 and verse 19. Talks about, this is the beginning of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And it says, there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. Fine linen. Those are the references that we just read of the linen from Egypt. Now then, is he having a reference from specifically to Egypt? Well, maybe not, but it's the type of clothing that the rich would wear. The
thing on that purple,
the
color purple of the National Geographic, that was very, very expensive because it's made out of some kind of snake bone.
yeah.
But they said it stunk to high up. But people revered that stuff because of the color.
Because of the color. It was, well, even today we talk about royal purple. It was the color of royalty. And you're right, it was a color that, or from a dye that was made from snails. And supposedly it did stink.
What kind of dye did Lydia use? You don't remember?
She was a seller of purple, so that's what she would, I mean, she sold that type of clothing. Very possibly she purchased it from someone who made it. It's possible that she made it herself. We don't really know.
Did it signify royalty?
It did signify royalty, yes. It's not your clothing that the normal person would wear. So this type of industry, though, I mean, it's going to suffer as well because of this drought and the devastation. The networks, they that weave networks shall be confounded, is probably or possibly white clothing or white cloth, possibly dealing with cotton fabrics. The cotton fabrics would very possibly be more your everyday person's clothing and not the rich royalty clothing. And so he's dealing with both aspects. They that work in fine flax, those who produce the rich clothing, and they that weave networks or white clothing that the normal person would wear. And then the confounded in King James, New King James has ashamed, or the New American Standard has utterly dejected, which I thought was a good way of putting it. Utterly dejected. Shows how massive this destruction is going to be. Verse 10 then, and they shall be broken in the purposes thereof, all that make sluices and ponds for fish. The purposes would be the foundations, is the idea. Probably has reference to the nobles in society, that those nobles are being broken, they're being brought low. Sluices is possibly the makers of dams, or possibly those who work for hire.
Michael, the New King James says, and its foundations will be broken, and all who make wages will be trouble of soul. So like the entire economy is like collapsed.
Right. That's the point that we were going to make. All classes of people, whether you're dealing with rich, whether you're dealing with poor, or the middle class, however you want to express those ideas, from the highest to the lowest, they're all going to suffer affliction. We'll stop there then and begin with verse 11 then, Lord willing, I think week after next.